Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a totally fascinating framework that, honestly, might completely redefine how you read biblical texts. Often when we stumble across really complex ideas in Scripture, we tend to kind of flatten them out just to make them manageable in our heads. But our source text today introduces a paradigm called the triunity of righteousness, and it's a real game changer, proving that righteousness isn't just some static rule, but a dynamic three-part covenantal flow.
Which brings us to a really crucial question. Have we flattened the meaning of righteousness? Have we mistakenly reduced this dynamic, living concept into a flat, one-dimensional moral checklist? Because when we do that, we end up pitting verses against each other, arguing endlessly over things like faith versus works. But in reality, the biblical authors had a much more robust, multidimensional view of what it actually means to be right with the Creator. So to unpack this, we're going to follow this covenantal flow like a river across 6 steps, defining righteousness, Yahweh as the source, Messiah as the means, the believer as the fruit, the boundaries of nomos versus animos, and finally, the complete divine covenant flow.
All right, Section 1, defining righteousness and moving beyond a single abstract concept.
Okay, let's start with the Hebrew word tzedakah. This grounds righteousness as an active, relational faithfulness, not just a static status. Think of it less like a noun and way more like a verb. It isn't just some abstract moral concept floating around in the ether. It actually describes what practically aligns with the character and purposes of Jehovah. It's about fulfilling a relationship perfectly.
And then on the flip side, we have the Greek term diakosune, which denotes the quality of being right in the eyes of God. Now, the real magic happens when we realize Scripture holds both of these relational and qualitative dimensions together seamlessly. They absolutely aren't competing definitions. They're essentially two lenses looking at the exact same divine reality.
Moving right along to Section 2, YHWH, the ultimate source.
Well, every river has to start somewhere, right? And His righteousness is the ultimate standard. It is literally tzedakah in action. It's His totally unwavering determination to set things right and keep those ancient covenant promises He made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This righteousness accomplishes both judgment against rebellion and the absolutely beautiful redemption of His people.
And this perfectly frames what the Apostle Paul is getting at when he announces the gospel in Romans 1:17. He's showing us that the Father's faithfulness, this ancient covenant-keeping righteousness, is now actively and finally unveiled to us. It isn't hidden anymore. The source is opened up and the water is officially flowing.
Which brings us to Section 3, Messiah, the perfect means.
So, flowing downward from that source, we hit the conduit. Where the people of Israel historically rebelled, the Messiah remained perfectly faithful. He doesn't just stand on a hillside teaching the law, He perfectly fulfills every single requirement of it. And by our union with Him, His perfect faithfulness actually becomes our justification.
Paul actually nails this in 1 Timothy 3:16, stating that the Messiah was vindicated by the Spirit. This is huge because it proves that the righteous one had his perfect covenantal obedience fully validated by heaven. His righteousness is the flawless means of our redemption.
Now for Section 4, the believer, the living fruit.
Okay, so the water has flowed from the source through the conduit, and now it waters the ground. There is a very specific sequential biblical order happening here. Step 1, faith receives righteousness. Step 2, the Spirit produces righteousness within us. Step 3, obedience demonstrates that righteousness. Our righteous deeds do not purchase our salvation, no way. They are the fruit revealing true covenant participation. John gets incredibly practical about this in his first epistle. He confirms that true righteousness is not just a title you hold in your head. It is an active, living practice. You literally can't just claim the status without producing the fruit. The life of a believer should be a living, breathing demonstration of the source. And Paul, he totally echoes this exact command, to actively pursue righteousness. It's not some passive state you just chill in. It's the visible fruit of a life fundamentally transformed and empowered by the Spirit to actually live it out. This matters so much because it bridges that massive gap between what we conceptually believe and how we actively walk through the world every day.
All right, Section 5, nomos versus animos, understanding the boundaries.
To really wrap our heads around this triunity, we have to look at two vital Greek concepts. On one side, we have nomos, the law, which Paul calls holy, righteous, and good. On the other side, we have animos, meaning lawless,
or being completely outside the covenantal order of Jehovah. The tragedy that Scripture warns about isn't the nomos. The real tragedy is living in animos and rejecting the divine order entirely.
Because of the gospel, we are absolutely not called to be lawless. We're actually enabled by the Spirit to step out of anomos and step into what is called enomos, meaning being in laud or subject to the law of the Messiah. It means we are finally, truly enabled to fulfill the righteous requirements of the law through obedience.
And finally, Section 6, the divine covenant flow, grace from start to finish.
So here is where the whole shebang comes together perfectly. The Father reveals the righteousness, the tzedakah. The Son perfectly accomplishes it, and the Spirit forms it right within the saints. It is one continuous covenantal flow that begins and ends entirely with divine grace.
If you take away just one thing from our source text today, let it be this: grace never, ever leaves a person unchanged. The very same gospel that justifies a sinner is the exact same gospel that sanctifies them. Faith receives salvation, for sure, but that same faith absolutely must produce a walk of obedience.
I want to leave you with something to really chew on. If righteousness isn't just a static, one-dimensional rule, but rather a continuous, living divine flow from the Father, through the Son, and into you via the Spirit, how is that going to change your study of Scripture tomorrow? When you read the word righteousness next time, look for the flow. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep pursuing that knowledge.